Have you ever noticed how differently two people can respond to the exact same difficulty? One collapses under the weight of it. The other stands firm, unshaken, even when the outcome is still uncertain. The difference usually isn't circumstance, it's trust. Today, I want to show you what actually changes in your life when you decide to trust God completely. Not partially, not conditionally, but completely. Proverbs 3:5-6 says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to Him, and He will make your paths straight." Notice the word all, not most of your heart, all of it. 1. Your anxiety loses its grip even when your circumstances don't change. I once heard about a woman who lived with constant low-level dread for years, convinced that peace could only come once her situation improved. Then, something shifted internally, long before her circumstances did. Here's the truth. Philippians 4:6-7 tells us not to be anxious about anything, but to present our requests to God, and His peace will guard our hearts and minds. Complete trust doesn't wait for resolution to produce peace. It produces peace in the middle of the unresolved, not denial, supernatural release. 2. Your need for control quietly loosens. A man I knew spent years micromanaging every detail of his life, terrified of what might happen if he loosened his grip even slightly. Listen carefully. Psalm 46:10 says, "Be still and know that I am God." Complete trust doesn't mean abandoning responsibility. It means recognizing that control was always somewhat of an illusion to begin with. And surrendering that illusion actually creates space for God to work in ways striving never could. Not passivity, surrendered striving. 3. Your decisions become less reactive and more rooted. I remember hearing about someone who used to make major life decisions purely out of fear or urgency, scrambling for the fastest solution instead of the wisest one. Here's what you need to understand. Isaiah 30:15 tells us that in returning and rest we shall be saved. In quietness and trust shall be our strength. When you trust God completely, decisions stop being driven by panic and start being shaped by patience, because you're no longer convinced that everything depends entirely on you. Not indecision, grounded discernment. If this message is speaking to your heart right now, subscribe and write, "Lord, I trust you completely," in the comments. Stay with me, because the next 4 changes go even deeper. 4. Comparison starts to lose its power over you. A woman I heard about spent years measuring her life against everyone else's timeline, convinced she was somehow behind. Complete trust in God's specific plan for her own life slowly dissolved that constant comparison. Jeremiah 29:11 reminds us that God knows the plans He has for us, plans to prosper and not to harm us. When you actually trust that your path is being personally directed, other people's paths stop feeling like a threat or a measuring stick. Not competition. Personal confidence in God's plan. 5. Your prayers shift from demanding outcomes to seeking alignment. I once knew a believer whose prayer life used to consist almost entirely of specific requests and desperate bargaining. Over time, as trust deepened, his prayers began sounding less like demands and more like surrender. Matthew 6:10 teaches us to pray, "Your will be done." Complete trust changes the posture of prayer itself, from trying to convince God of what you want to genuinely seeking what He already knows is best. Not passive resignation, active alignment. 6. Disappointment stops shaking your identity. A man I knew used to interpret every setback as evidence that God had abandoned him, or that his faith was somehow inadequate. As trust deepened, disappointment still came, but it no longer defined how he saw himself or God. Romans 8:28 tells us that God works all things together for good for those who love Him. Complete trust doesn't eliminate disappointment. It changes what disappointment is allowed to mean about your relationship with God, not immunity to pain, stability through it. 7. Your capacity for genuine gratitude expands, even in difficult seasons. I remember hearing about someone walking through real hardship who nonetheless described an unusual depth of gratitude she hadn't experienced before. Not gratitude that ignored the difficulty, but gratitude that existed alongside it. 1 Thessalonians 5:18 instructs us to give thanks in all circumstances, not necessarily for every circumstance, but within it. Complete trust makes room for a gratitude that doesn't depend on everything going right, not forced positivity, deepened perspective. As we reflect on these 7 changes, understand this: none of them happen instantly, and none of them mean life suddenly becomes easy. Trusting God completely doesn't remove hardship, disappointment, uncertainty, or waiting. What it changes is how you carry all of that. Anxiety loosens its grip. Control softens into surrender. Decisions become rooted instead of reactive. Comparison loses its power. Prayer shifts from demand to alignment. Disappointment stops shaking your identity. Gratitude expands even in difficulty. This is precisely why Proverbs 3:5-6 specifies trusting with all your heart, not partial trust that only applies when circumstances make sense, and not conditional trust that depends on God meeting your expectations on your timeline. Complete trust means believing He's good and faithful, even in the exact moments you can't understand what He's doing. So today, take an honest look at where your trust remains partial. Is there an area where you're still leaning on your own understanding instead of surrendering it? Is there a decision, a relationship, a fear, or a disappointment you haven't fully released into His hands yet? Complete trust isn't a single decision made once. It's a posture chosen repeatedly, especially in the moments it feels hardest to choose. If this message spoke to your heart today, write, "Lord, I trust you completely," in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to release control and find real peace today. And subscribe so we can continue growing together in biblical wisdom every week. God bless you, my brother, my sister. Until next time.